Good evening, Canterbury. Thank you for joining us for this extra edition of NewsMakers. Well, Canterbury University has never been far from the headlines lately, as you've probably noticed. It's been an action-packed 6 months for Dr. Carr since he commenced his tenure as Vice-Chancellor. What are his top priorities? What are the biggest challenges facing the campus? And how does the new Vice-Chancellor intend stamping his mark on the direction of the university? It's a pleasure to welcome to CTV Dr. Carr. Thank you for joining us.
Mike, it's nice to be here.
Very good to have you aboard. Of course, most people will be well aware of your top-flight career history in business and banking. What propelled the career change?
Three things, Mike. First of all, the opportunity. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canterbury, Roy Sharp, left the position to go to Wellington, so we needed the opportunity. Secondly, clearly the challenge. A university is a major, complex and sophisticated organisation, and that's always a challenge. And thirdly, significance. It really matters. Education is the investment, above all else, that can change people's lives and this country's future.
Do you think we underestimate that? Have we taken that for granted?
I absolutely do believe that we've underestimated. You only have to look at President Obama. He has an hour to speak to the Muslim world. One of his 6 key points: the currency of the 21st century is education and innovation. It's that important.
I don't mean to psychoanalyse you, but you don't strike me as being a steady as she goes type leader. You seem to be more of the reformist model, you know, a change agent. Would that be fair?
I think I've been thrown in circumstances where there has been sometimes the need and sometimes the opportunity to set a course, and so that is probably a fair observation. And of course, I've chosen from time to time to change my own course.
For sure. Now, of course, the government funding has taken a slightly different tack as well. We've got inflation-proofed funding for the tertiary sector this financial year, but not beyond. How much of a blow is that to tertiary education?
Well, I think, Mike, there's a series of choices which have been made, not just by this government, but also by the previous government, and one can understand why. The first choice was that the government needed to cap how much money it was spending on higher education in New Zealand. So the previous Labour government essentially block granted to the universities how much money they would have for what was called the student achievement component. And that's the block grant from the taxpayer to help a certain number of students with higher education. The students themselves then also have to pay a fee, which is about 1/3 of the total fee. So 2/3 is paid by the taxpayer through the government, 1/3 is paid by the student. So the students largely don't have that money, they borrow it. And again, they end up borrowing it from the government, in the end the taxpayer. So when the government is faced with the constraints it has, it said, well, enough's enough. And in the University of Canterbury's case, it said, here's $110 million based on a certain number of students. It's up to you now to manage that. Obviously, coming into this recession, more students have taken the opportunity to attend higher education and more have decided to stay on for longer. So we've got about 550 students now for whom there is no student achievement component or block grant. They still pay their share of the fee. And in the current budget, as you say, the government has given a heads up that it won't be in a position to inflation adjust their component and potentially not even the cap on student fees in 2011 and beyond.
How concerned are you about that outlook?
Well, I think if you don't respond to it, it's an erosion of the real resource you have for each student in the order for the University of Canterbury of between $4 and $6 million a year. You just simply cannot pretend that the quality of what you're doing will be sustained. It's a bit like the baker who just thinks you can take a slice out of the loaf and nobody will notice. Or the winemaker who thinks they'll just put an extra litre of water in with the wine. The University of Canterbury is not prepared any longer to participate in that erosion of quality, so we're having to respond appropriately.
And has that been the catalyst for this student levy of $533 plus GST?
In part it is, Mike. We talked to the Students' Association, said that you do realise that we are funded for a core research and teaching obligation. If we're constrained in the real resources, we will begin to withdraw the resources from some of the things that are less core to research and teaching. The Students' Association said, wait on, we don't actually think you're providing too much in the way of those student services. Let's talk about how we can protect them, have more visibility to what they are and what they cost, have a seat at the table in providing the advice on that, but let's fund them for what they are, which is student services.
How was that figure arrived at?
We've got an estimate roughly of how much we spend on those categories. The total is somewhat over $800 per student. We decided that there was a responsibility on the university not to seek full cost recovery. Roughly 75% is what we settled on, which gets you sort of roughly a $600 type levy. We've also decided to set aside a part of that for a building levy to provide infrastructure and services of a student amenity value. So there is an additional component that wasn't there before, as well as the funding of certain services that was previously provided out of the research and teaching funds.
Right. I note that the university recorded a $15 million surplus in 2008. And Canter's editor, for example, has cited that money as to, well, why won't the university show an act of faith and throw some of that money, if not all of it, to offset the student levy?
Right. I think the first thing we have to do is understand the nature of the surplus. We actually have a statutory requirement from the Tertiary Education Commission to run with 3% of our revenue as a surplus. Our revenue is about $270 million a year. So we're actually required by law to run a surplus of between $8 and $9 million. And that's the come and go money for the uncertainty and the shock. The government doesn't want us to make losses and come with an unexpected demand. In addition, last year, we obviously had interest income on our surplus funds, which was at a high rate of interest. Both the amount of the surplus funds has been used to build our biological sciences building, a $30 million project, and of course interest rates have fallen dramatically. So on a like-for-like basis, about $4 million of that surplus has already been consumed by a reduction in cash and interest rates as we've invested and the environment's changed. In addition, part of that surplus is in kind. It's gifts that people gave us, sometimes in kind and sometimes in cash for a dedicated purpose. So it's not actually the case that it looks like a surplus. We don't have to give it back to the government. It's a surplus that we actually use within our building program.
Two quick questions. Why not make those student support services user pays?
Some of the services already have a user pays component, so where appropriate they have it. Our recreation centre, for instance, is funded that way. But some of them it simply would be too expensive to charge at the point of use. For instance, student advocacy services, when a student gets into difficulty and wants to appeal against a decision, you can't charge them $300 an hour for lodging an appeal. Some of the health services, for instance, where we do have a component of that is funded by the government under a capitation levy, but a significant component is coming out of that levy. So, as with any types of services, a user pays isn't always the fairest way because at the point of use, it's too expensive and won't be used.
What about for students like Liz Gordon, who wrote a letter to the paper this week? A part-time student, should they have to pay that levy?
We had a long conversation with the Student Association about what amounted to fairness. Part-time students who are on campus have access to exactly the same services. Health services, student advocacy services, careers advisory services. We don't ration them to 1/10 or 1/5 because they're a 1/10 student. So the students themselves believed, as a student body, that it was fairer to treat them that way. Now, the exception is those students who are remote from campus and simply cannot get to campus to use those services.
Okay, we'll take a break. We are with Dr. Rod Carr. Coming up, we'll have a look at the Conservatorium. You might have heard about it. That's coming up shortly.